Ch3 Symptomatology of the month of January 2015 in France. When I received this invitation, I enthusiastically accepted the offer from Ebrahim Moussa and the University of Notre Dame to participate in this encounter here in Rome. And even though I am not a believer, at least in the classical sense, by which I mean that I am not what is called one of the faithful within the meaning of the churches, I do believe that the question of faith and fidelity is the great problem of what I call non-human being, as it continuously confronts what, in the normal and the pathological, Georges Canguilhem called the infidelity 89 of the milieu. Humankind is characterized by the fact that it produces its own milieu, its own living environment, and this self-production constantly confronts an infidelity to itself that it structurally secretes throughout the exosomatic organogenesis in which the irresistible concretization of its technicity consists. Canguilhem concludes that the power and temptation to fall sick are an essential characteristic of human physiology. 90 Hence we might refer in this instance to an organology of temptation. The reason for my enthusiastic response to your invitation is that, for a long time, I have wanted to engage a dialogue with theology, and hence with theologians, and because at this very moment, in Paris, I have been trying to renew the question of hermeneutics, in the current context of reticulated society, the worldwide establishment of which began in the spring of 1993 with the introduction of the World Wide Web, and which we might say constitutes a specific stage in the accomplishment of what Martin Heidegger called Gestalt. Beginning as it did on April 30, 1993, this structural and generalized reticulation, which also involved sending a very large fleet of geostationary satellites into orbit, has, since then, caused something that is not quite a revolution, but that has for several years been referred to as a disruption, rupture, upheaval, disturbance, interruption, a term currently utilized by marketing but that originates from physics. That the current use of this term comes from marketing is no accident. The disruption provoked by marketing is the very thing that has given rise to the systemic infidelity characteristic of consumer capitalism and to its consequent immense problems. I would like to engage a dialogue not only with theologians but with those who care about the spirituality of esprit, Geist, spirit, spiritus, and hence also with the anthropologists of Mana and how I aspire to reopen a question of spirit rendered unthinkable by that science of the mind, calling itself cognitive science. And it has done so thanks to what, according to my own analysis, amounts to a denial, Verneinung, and repression, Verdrängung, of the spirit insofar as it is always the precarious and detestable unification of a division that can never be eliminated, which means that one can lose spirit, lose one's mind, which also means, in French as in English, to become mad, to go crazy. The French translation of wits as mot d'esprit, the sound of which resembles the English wit, allows us to understand how Freud highlighted the fundamental relationship that exists between the spirit and laughter, and I am working into a forthcoming book a chapter that will be called Briar Jaune, Yellow. Laugh, a French phrase that means to laugh in such a way as to conceal one's annoyance, one's pain, one's embarrassment, one's sadness, or distress, or disorientation, sometimes one's humiliation, and the despair this always causes. The relationships between spirit, laughter and despair are keystones of psychoanalysis inasmuch as I believe it to have been historically constituted through the experience of melancholy, which Freud discussed in Civilization and its Discontents 91 and which I interpret as an experience of the pharmacon, an experience that Paul, Valery and Edmund Husserl had already identified as a poisonous becoming in the life of the spirit, Valery in La Crise de l'Esprit 92 and Husserl in The Crisis of European Sciences 93, a becoming and a development that we are now facing on a global scale, and that we experience through the profound changes taking place in the psychic apparatus as a result of the technologies of mind and spirit that today serve to destroy the spirit. In Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud raises questions that I believe are prerequisites for any analysis of the contemporary psychic and spiritual apparatus insofar as it is, moreover, deprived of spirit and threatened with the loss of reason, in a sense that is primordial and irreducible, constituted as it is by its pharmacological character, so that it can always be despiritualized, so to speak, that is, become intoxicated, and thereby regress, of which the rajon that gripped France in January after the killings of January 7th, and the coverage of Charlie Hebdo that followed, constitutes a symptom of extraordinary complexity. This potential despiritualization is the underlying basis of what Christianity calls temptation. It is also the tension that runs through the bipolarity constituting what Gilbert Simondon calls the psychic individual. And it is, as well, what consumer capitalism induces, by systematically soliciting the drives at the expense of the libidinal economy as conceived by Freud, for whom it was the guarantee maintaining the unity of the psychic apparatus, and, along with it, of society. If the context of this intervention, in which I began by speaking to you of belief, faith, fidelity, spirit, laughter, the unconscious, temptation, the libidinal economy and contemporary capitalism, has much to do with what happened in Paris between 7th and 11th January, and where I sincerely doubt that this was a genuine moment of public debate, which freedom of expression alone makes possible, this being also the condition of political life, it nevertheless also concerns, and much more broadly, the loss of the feeling of existing that afflicts our societies, a feeling that I began to analyze in 2003, in Aimer, Samer, News Aimer, a book concerned with the events that unfolded in 2001 and 2002.94. As for the way that 2015 began in France, it has been dominated less by political debate than by reactions and symptoms, in the sense of symptomatology invoked by Paulo Vignola, 95, and this is why I have chosen as my title, Symptomatology of the Month of January 2015 in France. As such, this response to what some believe we should call January 15th, as in France one refers to May 68, seems to me to amount to a form of stupidity that is perfectly symptomatic of the generalized disorientation of minds and spirits characteristic of a derelict world. What I try to think, and which inclines me towards you despite my lack of religious and theological culture, lies not only in what can be called the spiritual question, but also, inscribing myself in the aftermath of what is called, including in theology, the death of God, in the following. I believe with Freud that the Father is all the more powerful once he is dead, and that it is only in this way that it is possible to think, if it is possible, what is often wrongly called the return of the religious in the context of contemporary science and technology, which is to say of contemporary capitalism, for in this world these three terms are inseparable. I believe that the question of belief is not soluble into that of knowledge, the question of belief being therefore also that of faith, and hence of fidelity. I take extremely seriously the Nietzschean statement that, describing capitalism as nihilism, since what is involved with the leveling of all values is clearly capitalism, which also constitutes the horizon of the work of Max Weber, proposes that what is required beyond nihilism, and as the transvaluation of all values, is a new belief. What is the relationship between the possibility of this new belief and religious belief? And, more particularly, how does this question arise in a singular way in the context of what we now call the Anthropocene, which is also the context of the encyclical on ecology soon to be published by Pope Francis? 96. These are the organizing questions for what I will say in what follows. And here, I wonder how we can imagine, if it is imaginable, that there could be Jewish and Muslim theologies of the death of God, as there are Christian theologies of the death of God, the death of God through his Son being an originally Christian concept, as Christianity is the religion of the meaning of the death of Christ, and because, after Hegel, Marx and Nietzsche, this mortality of God takes on a new meaning, through which this theology explores and interprets the death of God. These questions form the context for my reflections on the object of desire, which led me to propose that God is the name of the object of all desires, and I am here only repeating, in a perhaps debatable way, what I believe I have understood in Aristotle's treatises on the soul and metaphysics, and which I argue is the meaning of the term ontotheology. To accept this statement God refers to the object of all desires is to turn questions of belief, faith and fidelity, which were conceived on the basis of religious injunctions and prescriptions, into questions of libidinal economy, where libidinal economy obviously refers not just to the economy of sexuality, even if it is always also the economy of sexuality. It was on the basis of such considerations that, 7 years ago, in a dialogue with Jean-Luc Nancy, I took a position that was not exactly for religion, but for a dialogue with religion faced with the adversity, and hence with an adversary, constituted by the hegemony of marketing. Over Ways of Life 97 and this dialogue, in which I explained my decision not to become involved in the project of the journal that published this dialogue, the particular issue of which was given the title Pourquoi nous ne sommes pas chrétiens, Why We Are Not Christians. I said that, if it is true that in the 19th century religion and its ecclesiastical institution had, in their institutional hegemony, effectively become opponents of thought and philosophy, nevertheless the historical task of philosophy today is, on the contrary, to rethink the question of desire with religions and to struggle against the liquidation of desire by marketing, which subjects scientific programs to the liquidation of the life of the spirit, in the sense of Valery, Husserl and Freud, and of the psychic apparatus that we refer to, at the origin of ontotheology and with Aristotle, as the noetic soul. This is also why, more recently, I stated to my Christian and non-Christian friends that I plan to start a movement gathering together compagnons de route of Pope Francis. This French expression, compagnons de route, fellow travelers, refers to those intellectuals who, after the Second World War, accompanied the French Communist Party without themselves being communists. Today, Pope Francis, whom I consider exemplary in his struggle against corruption, of souls, bodies, institutions, organizations and terrestrial environments, needs companions, and it was to further this approach that I came here, to Rome, at the invitation of a Muslim, and to address to you and to the Pope an invitation to visit France in the coming autumn, prior to the Conference of the United Nations, 98, and to the Basilica of Saint Denis, a place of great importance, if not a Mecca, in the history of Christianity, and a place where I, along with my friends and companions, am attempting to foster a new approach. Today, the word esprit, Geist, spirit is, then, the subject of a denial and a repression, and at the same time of embarrassment and even of a malaise, or of discontent, which is obviously in part tied to the discontent of civilization and culture referred to by Freud, and where le mot esprit, der Witz, wit, which introduces laughter into the mind, is what also gives rise, behind laughter, to the diabolon of the unconscious, which is also what, in dialogue, paves the way for Socrates' dame? N. I have argued for 12 years that capitalism is destroying the spirit. It is not just that the word spirit was used by thinkers who then inspired totalitarian practices, Hegel, whose dialectic became the dictatorship of the proletariat historically concretized as the Soviet Gulag. Heidegger, with his question of Geist in the Rectorate Address, and as was unearthed and exhumed in particular by Derrida, who was not only attracted to Nazism, but allowed a fundamental element of his thought to bend in that direction. It is not only because this word, spirit, happened to be used by thinkers tied directly or indirectly to what since Hannah Arendt we call totalitarianism that the word spirit, Geist, esprit, has been repressed. And it is not only because the Trinitarian spirit lies at the heart of Christianity. Without in any way denying the seriousness of this or that perspective, tying the word spirit to the totalitarian perspective on totality, and without wanting to deny what muting it, so to speak, gave to the laicization that was enshrined in the secularization of the origins of capitalism, I think that what constitutes the fundamental principle of the liquidation of the concept of spirit is that the spirit is that which returns as the incalculable, and as the ghost of the incalculable, whereas capitalism, as Max Weber said very early on, not long after Nietzsche, is what must eliminate the incalculable, which it does even at the risk of eliminating itself. Among the fields of science, it is cognitive science, but in this case I wish to contest its scientific status, that is, its rationality, that executes this liquidation of the question of spirit, and that makes this liquidation, in a way that is the complete opposite of my own position. The very foundation of science, and hence of the life of what is no longer the human spirit, in Hannah Arendt's sense when she refers to the life of the spirit, but the mind, itself thought mechanistically and computationally. How and why is it possible for the mind to dilute and disintegrate the spirit, the latter being the guarantor, in gnosis, of integrity, which in the first place refers to the integrity of truth, Thea. And I must note, here, without having the time for elaboration, that integrity does not mean totality. This dilution began with the expansion of cybernetics during and after the Second World War, in a context of potential nuclear conflict, firstly with Nazi Germany and then with Soviet communism, ultimately leading to artificial intelligence programs and hence to the elaboration of the cognitive sciences paradigm. This possibility, however, rests more profoundly on a feature of what, since the 20th century, and after Heidegger, we call the history of metaphysics, where Kant represents a turning point. I have tried to show, in Technics and Time, 3, that there are paradoxical and contradictory tensions between the theory and practice of Immanuel Kant with respect to the possibility of schematization. 99 I argue that the schematization that allows the understanding to meet up with intuition presupposes a fourth, technological synthesis of the transcendental imagination, which thus goes beyond what Kant explains in the transcendental deduction of categories, and I also argue that we must make this question more general by injecting it into the heart of psychoanalysis and by showing that this question is what cognitive science is incapable of thinking, and what it denies in advance, regardless of the reference to the computer as the model of thinking conceived as calculation, by distinguishing the drives from the instincts, reserving the term drive for what submits to the difference of a libidinal economy. Derrida's difference within the drive being, therefore, unlike instinct, capable of changing its object, submitting the drive to a deferral of the satisfaction of its goal, which also produces a differentiation, an idiomatization and a diversification of these circuitous paths via which the drive constitutes its object of desire according to the schema of what Jacques Lacan called Das Ding. Psychoanalysis thereby describes an economy that presupposes the technicization of life, but where psychoanalysis does not itself perceive this precondition of what it describes. This means not only that the reality principle, of which work is the effective reality, is imposed on every form of human life, and constitutes the condition of exosomatic organogenesis, but that it is only through the mediation of the transitional object that the psychic individual can be inscribed and formed in, and through the symbolic. On the basis of the work of Husserl and Derrida, I have proposed the concept of tertiary retention in order to think the transitional object that is also and already a pharmacon, as Donald Winnicott shows, just as the fetish allowed Freud to think the drive. And I have striven to show that the tertiary retention that is the pharmacon, of which the transitional object and the fetish are primordial instances, plays a crucial role in the possibility of gnosis, and especially in the apodictic gnosis that rationality constitutes in the Western tradition and in relation to which Husserl showed that the pharmacon of alphabetical writing is its condition. The pharmacon is thus the condition of the dual intellective and spiritual dimension of what Aristotle called the noetic soul. This is thought in Kant as the dual dimension of consciousness formed through the understanding and reason and the encounter with intuition, that is, the world, desire being the dynamic process of everything through which, in the critique of judgment, the world exceeds itself, that is, infinitizes itself. The noetic soul is intellective and spiritual, and this is why Greek nous is translated into Latin as both spiritus and intellectus. Kant's critique of reason distinguished the intellect from what he called, not spirit but, precisely, reason. He argued that this analytical faculty that is the intellect, as the understanding, can unfurl the logical consequences of any analytical, conceptual given, on the basis of pure concepts of understanding, without anything else having to be added. I myself argue that this automatic intellect, which can automatize itself in the sense of artifactualizing itself presupposes a primordial artifactuality of the schematization, and, through it, of the understanding itself, that is, of its concepts and categories, and that it can, therefore, function without reason, as, for example, automated artificial intelligence. To generalize Freud's position is to show that desire, and I refer to desire in the sense that Diotima speaks of it in Symposium, that is, as the condition of logos, of knowledge, of philosophy and of the quest for truth, is itself conditioned by its retentional artifactuality, by tertiary retention, for instance by the transitional object, but also by the rosary, and this is why Pascal can raise the question of an automatic technicity of faith. It is due to this primordial artifactuality of the spirit, which is originally divided precisely because the artifact is the pharmacon that always makes possible both the infinite exceeding of the world by the world, and the imminent possibility of ruining it by turning it into the immanent, the vile. That non-human beings can individuate and differentiate themselves. The spirit is always already divided into spirits that nevertheless always seek the unity of a spirit, a Geist, a spiritus beyond intellectus and beyond Zeitgeist, such as when language idiomatizes and localizes itself in diachronic multiplicities, as long as this is not prevented by the intermediation of what Sylvain Auroux described as grammatization, 100, which, today, in reticulated society, is reaching an extreme limit, that is, indeed, an apocalyptic limit, in the Greek sense of this word. In Disbelief and Discredit, the third volume of which is entitled The Lost Spirit of Capitalism, I tried to show how the war of spirits has become a war against the spirit, a war led by the mind, which was already the issue for Adorno when he described how that reason that stems from the Enlightenment has degraded into rationalization. 101. I have since endeavored to show, in automatic society, how this leads to a destruction of the social relation. 102. A society, whatever its form, is above all an apparatus for the production of fidelity. Capitalism has transformed the type of fidelity that has structured Western society, founded on the faith proper to monotheistic religious belief, into trust, understood as fiduciary calculability. Credit is thus massively inverted into what consequently becomes discredit, and a completely new form of miscreance, of misbelief and miscreance, rationalization leading to what Max Weber described as disenchantment. I argue that rationalization and disenchantment are tied to a process of grammatization that connects back to the whole history of the hypomnesic pharmacon that Socrates described in Phaedrus. Grammatization affects this disenchantment as the technology of calculation, in particular as financial technology, as Clarice Herrenschmidt shows in Les Trois Écritures. 103 It begins to spread across society after the Renaissance and becomes more widely generalized as the capitalist organization of social relations. It is pharmacological, just like the book, which made possible sophistical logography as a means of power, but also formed the milieu for the enrichment of profane knowledge. The alphabetical noetic milieu becomes the apodictic milieu, that is, it conforms to the canons of Thea, and it is constituted through the books of geometry, history, geography, literature, law and so on, such as for example the book, that is, sacred writing, all these books being what Husserl called objects invested with spirit. 104 It was Socrates who opened up the question of the pharmacology of spirit that books form, and therefore also the book, whether the Bible, the Gospels or the Quran. Capitalism arose out of the spiritual conflict that resulted from the advent of the printing press, which again divided Christianity in the service of a new therapeutics. This was firstly religious, in the form of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, and then secular, that is, political and scientific. This then constitutes the stakes of the bourgeois French Revolution, which, in France, preceded by some years the Industrial Revolution that began in England. Hence begins the transformation of fidelity into trust and secularization, the full accomplishment of which is what Nietzsche called nihilism. After the printing press there occurred a pharmacological turn, a continuation of grammatization via the reproduction of gestures by automatons, leading to mechanism. In this turn, what changed was the relationship between odium and negotium, this becoming then passed through a new socialization of hypomata, wherein the latter eventually led to the formation of the ratio now understood no longer as reason but as calculation, firstly in the form of those account books examined by Weber, and then as the mechanical reproduction of documents leading eventually to computing and ultimately to the current digital reticulation. I argued in disbelief and discredit that this transformation is reflected in the American motto inscribed on the dollar bill, which, in positing that it is in God we trust, is no longer quite a statement of our belief in God. This strange evolution, from to believe to trust of the verb used to designate the relationship of fidelity of noetic creatures to their creator would not be comprehensible were it not for the fact that we read it inscribed on paper that constitutes an accounting unit, a unit of currency. It is the relation to what stands, and to the one who stands, on another plane than creatures, a relation that was constituted in a relation to the book, which is therefore affected by what, in Nietzsche's word, thus takes the name of nihilism, Heidegger arguing that, with this name, it is, for Nietzsche, the supersensible as a whole that is in question. If Nietzsche can say that it is still a long time before the murderers of God will be able to have understood what will have been their gesture, I come too early. This tremendous event is still on its way, wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder need time. The light of the stars needs time. Deeds need time, even after they are done, in order to be seen and heard. 105. Perhaps we ourselves, who arrive more than 130 years after this word of Nietzsche, in the Gay Science, in 1884, are now entering the trial of this revelation. As such, now perhaps the dark night, and not just the shadows that herald it, falls upon us, and does so as this apocalypticism without God that now haunts the entire world, given that since 2008 the consumerist model, by collapsing, has made clear that it is no longer just the financial objects of logos, constituted by their hypomata, which in the 20th century changed their meaning and social function, but also everyday and familiar objects, and, along with them, and since they alone can definitively undermine the foundations, das Ding, the thing. The thing is the object of all desires, but it is an object that does not exist, if we admit with Lacan that this thing is an object of which there is never any experience. It is a kind of a priori of desire that closely resembles Aristotle's theos. The object of all desires, das Ding, taking thus the place of God, opens, like the theos of Aristotle, every horizon of expectation, and in this way constitutes the arch pretension. The capturing of odium and its dissolution into negotium is the reality of that industrial modernity that generates technology and what some people call technoscience. 106 Only now has this been fully accomplished, as the information society and the knowledge industry at the cost of a mutation of the university whereby the data sciences replace the humanities, all in the service of innovation conceived as the chronic obsolescence of industrial products, and leading to the systemic infidelity that establishes itself as libidinal diseconomy. The great transformation that allowed the market to be disembedded in the form of a total domination of negotium was enabled only by placing odium into its service. Science, which fell within the sphere of odium, and technics, which fell within negotium, science and technics thus being opposed just as the nobles who did not work were fundamentally separated from the needy, become, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, confounded. This confusion has been the condition of possibility of capitalism and of its accomplishment as nihilism. And yet hypomnesis, which is to say mnemotechnics, and, with it, technics in general, has always been the condition of anamnesis, which is to say, of knowledge as it was conceived by Socrates, that is, as the experience of apodictic truth, see Plato's Meno. It is this that Jacques Derrida made clear in Plato's Pharmacy. 107 is, then, the opposition between science and technics, translated socially into the nobility of odium and the ignominy of negotium, nothing more than a social construction elaborated by the dominant to justify their domination, as was claimed by both bourgeois and then socialist revolutionaries? Is it what must be fought against in the service of a new revolution that may never come? I believe otherwise. Odium and negotium constitute the bipolarity constitutive of the tension characteristic of the pharmacological situation resulting from the exosomatic condition in which consists the organogenesis of the non-inhuman being. In this situation, a form of knowledge, whatever it may be, as savoir-faire, savoir-vivre or savoir conceptual, knowledge of how to do, live or conceptualize, is constituted by organological artifacture, which in turn constitutes the zeitgeist. It is grammatization that enables the analytical discretization on which operations of the understanding are founded, delivering to reason the materials for an interpretation of ends such that they rise above analysis only on the condition that they break with it, and do so as decision, that is, as bifurcation. With this last term, I am adopting the vocabulary of systems theory, which seems to me to be necessary in order to think the future within the Anthropocene. This is the name by which we refer to what is in fact the concrete reality of nihilism. As the leveling of all values, the nihilism that is the Anthropocene imposes an entropic becoming without a future, where the stakes of spirit are the difference between the future and becoming, between avenir and devenir. Becoming is entropic. The future is neganthropic. Both human entropy and human negantropy are produced by the toxic and curative potentialities of the pharmacon, which stems from exosomatic organogenesis. It is towards a constant re-elaboration of this state of fact in the service of a state of law that the spirit works to inscribe the difference between becoming and future. This question is being played out today, and it is being carried to an extremity that was still inconceivable just a few years ago. So-called correlationist models of the automated processing of big data make real and concrete the possibility of an automatic society that will prove to be unlivable, because it is entropic, condemned to a brief existence, something that worries Stephen Hawking and the scientists who co-signed his recent column about artificial intelligence. 108 Such are the stakes of the Anthropocene, and hence of ecology as an organology of reason and a pharmacology of spirit, calling for an urgent re-evaluation of the hermeneutic question in reticular society, a re-evaluation in the service of what I call the Neganthropocene, understood from the perspective of a neganthropology. 4 elements of neganthropology: the augmentation and enhancement of the human brain, undertaken by arranging so-called neurotechnological prosthetic pathways, such as cerebral implants, in combination with neurochemical pathways, so as to optimize neural performance, and conceived in direct relation to these additional units, is a new stage in the history of noetic life and of the organological augmentation and transformation that has, ever since the beginning of hominization, occurred continuously. As with many human organs, the brain has always organologically augmented and transformed itself. This self-transformation is precisely what characterizes noetic life, inasmuch as it is also and immediately technical life, that is, a form of life that realizes its dreams. But, unlike other organs, the brain can be enhanced through internal processes of disorganization, that is, defunctionalizations, and reorganization, refunctionalizations, that occur in accordance with external organs. These disorganizations and reorganizations correspond to what Freud described as defunctionalizations and refunctionalizations of the sensory motor system. And we now know that these transformations are based on what Stanislas Dehaene has described as neuronal recycling. What is really new about this organological transformation, this endosomatization of the exosomatic, which consists in this addition of units, that is, prostheses conceived and fabricated exosomatically but endosomatically implanted, just as are those prostheses added to the heart or to the ears, lies in the fact that it is now tertiary retentions, that is, technical artifacts, which shape and materialize knowledge, that is, memory and spatialized time, produced in an industrial and standardized way, that are beginning to be introduced into the organ of primary retentions and secondary retentions, that is the brain. Hence is heralded the arrival and the realization of neuroindustry, some of whose issues were anticipated in the Final Cut, 2004, as Patricia Pisters has shown in her analysis of the film 109. The neuroindustry opens onto the more general question of the management of exosomatization. According to the selection criteria of the market, where exosomatization is in general terms what characterizes the technical form of life that appears with and as hominization. Transhumanist storytelling 110 is the attempt to legitimate the subordination of such a selection to the criteria of the market. This necessarily and exclusively computational criteriology, however, is absolutely